All right, well, if everyone's ready, I know maybe a couple people want to get another drink. But I'm going to segue off of Stephen's talk. So as Leah introduced me, my name is Kristen Deason. I'm with Terracon. I'm our group manager of our environmental planning department. And that we mainly focus on our natural resources, wetland delineation, permitting, threatened endangered species, all that. So what I've prepared today to kind of parallel Stephen's discussion from the federal side is just some consideration to some of the state regulations as they pertain to some of our tidal resources here in Georgia. And so I'll talk both about the CMPA as well as the Georgia Erosion and Sedimentation Act. So first one I want to introduce to y'all is the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act. That's the CMPA for short, and that was established in 1970. This is an act that was created to protect Georgia's coastal marshlands. It's actually a pretty unique act for the coastal states along the East Coast, where a lot of other states don't have these strict protections of our tidal resources. And it has actually afforded Georgia to protect these resources over the last 55 years, whereas a lot of our neighboring states, such as South Carolina and Florida, have seen a lot of these resources disappear from impacts for permitting or what. And so you need a CMPA permit for any water feature that is in a tidal resource, be it a dock, a marina, a dredge project, a bank stabilization. And the committee that actually approves these is the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act Committee. And so when you apply for these permits, you present them to the committee and they can either approve or deny them. And then you are actually subjected to a public appeal period as well, where the regulations are pretty strict that if someone has a grievance against your project, they can appeal it just because. So it's actually a pretty rigorous permitting process you have to go through. In the CMPA regulations, and in order to apply for these permits, it requires that you give consideration to 3 of these bullet points I have on the screen, and that is stormwater management measures, impervious surface coverage, and the marshlands buffer. So I'm going to touch on all 3 of those today, kind of as they pertain to redevelopment projects. Some of the project examples are brownfield, some of them are not, but I figured for the audience here today, you might like to see how we implement these. And really, the CMPA requires consideration of these 3 things because the act itself wants to protect the marshes, and therefore, obviously, stormwater and runoff into the marsh is a factor there. Okay. The CMPA itself was established in 1970. In 2007, it was amended to actually consider what they call the 50-foot marshlands buffer. And that is when you require a CMPA permit for your marina, your dock, whatever you may need it for, you have to consider protections of a 50-foot corridor from the marsh. And oftentimes when you hear us consultants talk, we call that the JD line. That is the break between the marsh and the upland. And so that 50-foot marshlands buffer is only applicable to the upland component. This is getting like in the weeds in terms of the regulations, which someone in the room helped write, Mike DeMel back there, so you can blame him. But the upland component of the project is basically defined as any area that serves or augments the marshlands component, which is essentially your in-water features. So you may be developing a 100-acre site, but you might have apartments that aren't actually tied to the in-water structure, and that would not be considered your upland component. So you really, when you're looking at this 50-foot marshlands buffer on potential redevelopment projects, you're looking at that as it relates to how it's tied to the in-water features. And you'll see I have a couple examples. Go ahead. Okay, so as I alluded to, there are certain protections that have been established in this 50-foot buffer. It really prohibits any land disturbance when you are on raw, undeveloped sites, because the intent is to protect the marsh, and therefore you want to leave that undisturbed vegetative buffer. When we have already developed sites, obviously we are in a sticky situation where we're asking ourselves, well, how do we maintain this 50-foot vegetative buffer when it doesn't even exist? And so the CMPA does limit what you can do in that buffer. It does allow some temporary structures to help with construction. It does allow some permanent structures if it supports the in-water features and so on and so forth. Okay, so now we'll get to some project examples to try to kind of help picture this. So we worked on a marina called Savannah Boathouse. It was actually built a couple years ago on Bull River. It was a redevelopment of a prior restaurant, shrimp dock, and casino boat facility. The restaurant burnt down some time ago and the casino boat went defunct, and so essentially our client bought the property to redevelop it into a marina. The issue we encountered here was obviously there was no undisturbed buffers on the site at the time of redevelopment. And there was also a very interesting parcel configuration, which you'll see here in a second. And therefore, if we had to abide by this 50-foot buffer, the property would not be developable. And so the plan was, when we presented this to the CMPC and we went for our CMPA permit, was to try to retain any uplands we could as part of the buffer, install some vegetation where we could, improve the stormwater management, as you saw is a requirement of the CMPA. So here is the parcel configuration. The color kind of at the top of your screen, that is the marsh. It kind of divides the property in half. And obviously those bright colors are Crush and Run, or that's actually an old restaurant too, and then your gray colors are your pavement. So you can kind of imagine how all the way up to the river frontage is already developed, paved, gravel, whatever it may be, as well as the front side on the marsh. So go ahead to the next one. Here's some oblique aerials from Sage's Pictometry, which has some awesome images. So you can see, I think this, 2003, you can see there was a tiki hut that was just adjacent to the river, and they had some dock structures and everything. But that peninsula was already completely demolished and developed. And then go to the next one. This is an image of the restaurant as well. And what I want to show here is on the back side of the restaurant. You can see there's a mowed and maintained grass edge all the way up to the marsh. So again, no buffer to protect. This is just another view from the other side. So same thing here. Okay, and then this is that same aerial I just showed you. And so this is basically pre-redevelopment. So this is pre-marina. And this is what it looked like where the restaurant was there. So go to the next one. This is now the fully built out marina that we got the CMPA permit for. So as you can see, they utilize the entire upland areas all the way to the marsh edge. And you can see obviously the in-water features with all of the docks. Right up next to the water is their retail office / event rental space. So I want you to just pay attention to that because there's very limited room up there. I mean, that thing barely could squeeze in there. And then obviously all their dry dock storage is back here on the wider part of the property. So this next slide, this is the actual plans that were submitted. And the cross-hatching at the top is that marsh on that backside. And that yellow line is 50 foot off of it. So that was technically our 50-foot marshlands buffer that had this been a raw site, we could not have developed in that corridor. But because this was already a redevelopment project and they had already disturbed that, any improvements we're making to the property, because we're implementing stormwater management, which wasn't previously there. We're installing some vegetation strips and all that. Essentially, we're presenting that to the agencies as we're improving the property, obviously. And so, I just wanted to show this because that office retail space I showed you that was right adjacent to the river, that's all the way on the right-hand side of your screen. So none of that would have been accessible under the regulations had this not been a redevelopment project. So it kind of affords clients some unique opportunities to improve the properties and still support their use.
Been to a wedding in that building and it's awesome, so I'm glad it worked out.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to another project example. This is St. Mary's Wharf down in St. Mary's, Georgia in Camden County. And so this was actually the old Durango paper mill, if anyone's familiar with this. It is in the Brownfields program, and we did get all these permits, and then the developer walked. So this wasn't actually constructed, but we got all the permits in hand. And same thing kind of happened here. Obviously, it was an old paper mill that had been demolished, and so there was concrete and rubble all the way up to the edge of the riverfront, which you'll see in a second. So there was no way to protect the 50-foot buffer because it wasn't even there. So essentially, the developer wanted to try to improve that 50-foot buffer. And so they were proposing minimal development in that once they got rid of all the rubble, and that was just to put a passive recreational trail. So here's an image of it. This is 2003. So the red outline, which is a little hard to see, but the red outline is what we were calling our upland component. So that is serving the in-water features, which was the marina. This is before they demolished the paper mill. So all the buildings are still standing. Go to the next one. On the left is after they demolished everything. So we came into the picture to try to get these permits after everything was demolished. And so this was just concrete rubble. It was a mess. And obviously all that concrete rubble and bulkheads went all the way up to the North River, as you can see kind of on the right-hand side of that aerial. And so same thing here, that upland component, that 50-foot marshlands buffer, there was nothing to protect. Therefore, our client, in order to appease the CMPA regulations, we had to suggest improvements to stormwater, to impervious surface coverage, all that. And on the right-hand side of the screen is just the marina plan. So it was an in-water basin that was going to be excavated actually in the middle of all the rubble, as well as some transient docks out in the North River itself. Oh yeah, okay, sorry. So in this slide, I just wanted to show, the CMPA regs require you to consider your pre-construction impervious versus pervious versus post-construction. And the regulations actually, require, when you're doing raw land, to consider this. In redevelopment projects, you're in a unique scenario because obviously a site like this that had absolutely no stormwater management before, anything we could do to improve it is an improvement to the runoff, to the marshes. So in this case, pre-construction, we had 71% impervious, and post-construction, we were proposing 78% impervious. So obviously we were increasing our impervious coverage, but we were able to prove that, that wasn't significant really because we were implementing all these other measures, which I think the next slide, there we go. So the measures were these stormwater management aspects, which obviously we're all familiar with, but we were proposing to do some vegetative filter swales, obviously installing some landscaping. There wasn't any there to begin with. And then we also wanted to enhance that 50-foot buffer along the river where that trail was. We were going to install appropriate vegetation, and then obviously just install the stormwater system. Okay, so from those two examples, I wanted to move on to the Georgia Erosion Sedimentation Act 25-foot buffers. Okay, so I'm shifting a little bit. Those two projects I was just talking about needed a CMPA because we needed in-water features in tidal areas. The example project I'm about to show you guys, we did not need a CMPA. However, when you are developing adjacent to a marsh, even when you don't need a CMPA, there's 25-foot protected buffer off of the marsh, and that is according to this act. So different acts, same resource being protected, right? And so I think we can go to the next slide. When you need to impact within 25 feet of a marsh, you often need a buffer variance. Sometimes you don't because there are exempt activities. And if you read the regulations, you can figure out what activities are exempt. But in general, when you need permanent structures or permanent alteration within 25 feet of a marsh, you typically need a buffer variance. Now, had this project I'm about to show you, had they needed a CMPA, we could have taken care of the buffer impacts during the CMPA process because there's a 50-foot protected zone, right? But because this particular project did not need a CMPA, we had to get a buffer variance from EPD under a separate set of regulations. So this is the Blue Circle Concrete site on Hutchinson Island, right adjacent to Talmadge Bridge. We were working for Edgewater Resorts. This is another one we got the permits for, and the developer walked. So it's not built. I don't even know the current status of it. But obviously it was a former concrete production facility. There's two buffers I'm going to talk about. One set is adjacent to the Savannah River, which were completely disturbed. The other set of buffers is on this back tidal marsh, which actually were still intact with vegetation. So this is the parcel boundary. This is like a 99 color infrared. So as you can see, the frontage on the Savannah River completely developed up to the edge. But the back side, the back side, that darker color is kind of an inland marsh. And so that is completely under CMPA jurisdiction as a salt marsh. And so really we were getting this buffer variance to deal with the buffers on that. Go to the next slide. So we needed to encroach into this 25-foot buffer. And I've listed on the screen what we needed those encroachments for. So you can see the acreage totaled, 0.4 acres of encroachment for a security gate. Actually removing debris piles and restoring the area needs a buffer variance. So really applicable when we're, redeveloping these nasty sites. And then also installation of that multi-use trail. I will say there was an exempt buffer impact for this project, so it was not included in the buffer variance, and that was for maintenance of an existing structure. There was an existing culvert and wing wall and some roadway drainage that needed to be addressed, obviously to get it up to current standards, and that is actually exempt, doesn't need a buffer variance. So I have a couple more images to show you on this one, but this is the LiDAR elevation model. So the blue is low, so you can see that marsh on the backhand side is dark blue. Our upland areas are generally the yellow and the kind of the turquoise color on the front. Just to give you an idea, like kind of how the site was laid out. And then this final image is the site plan, and the color-coded areas is where we were proposing our buffer impacts. So those are the things that needed the buffer variance within the 25 foot of the marsh. And so there's a couple different ones. The green one was for the security gate. That was the new entrance road coming in. And then that coral pinkish color was for all that debris removal. Obviously trying to just make the site a little more pleasant to a view shed. So even that cleanup required this buffer variance. I think that's the last slide. So yeah, thank you guys. So hopefully that just helped you guys kind of visualize these odd regulations when it comes to our tidal resources here in the coastal counties of Georgia, and how we, have to kind of be creative and negotiate with the agencies when it comes to redevelopment projects, because they've written the regulations to really, be for raw undeveloped land, and they don't always apply. So it is kind of a creative approach, but you can get through the process like, we showed you. So
and that track report's now on for redevelopment. So
there you go.
Thank you.
Don't do questions. You're taking the questions.
If I can fix the mic.
Yes.
Testing. I'm sure you have some good questions. Anyone?
To kind of piggyback on what Kristen was saying, so I talked about Florida being, the third state to take over the federal Clean Water Act program, but I think it'd be good to mention after that presentation in particular that, the federal Clean Water Act sets the floor for states, and states can always have a stronger and more protective program. And in the case of Georgia, like the 25-foot buffer, that is triggered by what Georgia has defined as waters of the state, which is a much broader defined area from the federal jurisdiction. So you could potentially have a wetland or other water feature that has a 25-foot buffer under state law, but doesn't have any required permitting under federal law. So
that's actually the avenue that NGOs will challenge the project, is the state permitting process.
yeah, they certainly could. And of course, Clean Water Act has a citizen supervision, which a lot of NGOs make use of.
It's just tougher to get to the court.
Yes?
Can we expand a little bit on when it does a culvert sever jurisdiction of flow from our RPW?
Very good question. And I don't know that we really know that answer right now, to be honest. I think that's going to be part of what the next rule is going to really define, because that's, you know, if you think about it, you have, let's say for instance, you have a wetland feature that's kind of been developed around, and there's a bunch of roads and a bunch of culverts. It's basically at that point completely severed. But does it matter at what point in time it became severed? Does it matter if it was 50 years ago that the culvert went in, or does it matter if it was 2 years ago? Does it matter if the culvert is always flowing, or if it's only sometimes flowing? I think that's one of the key issues that the Corps and the EPA has to address. And, you know, candidly, I don't know the answer to that right now. I mean, obviously, working with a client, I would argue that the culvert is a distinguishable feature that clearly separates the wetland from an otherwise jurisdictional water, and therefore wouldn't be jurisdictional in the Clean Water Act. But I think that's one of the big questions that we still have out there. So.
Then you're also asking, like he said, you know, if the culvert was actually permitted, you know, he like, you know, it depends when it was installed. Let's say it predated the Clean Water Act, then maybe, you know, you had a case. But also a lot of culverts and road crossings go in unpermitted. And if that is what you're trying to use to like sever your jurisdiction, I guess from a consultant's perspective, we have a hard time believing that the Corps would allow that. So. Anything else?
Justin's gonna wrap it up.
Well, thank y'all.
Thank you guys. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much to Stephen and Kristen for those awesome presentations today. My name is Justin Johnson. I'm a geologist at WSP based in Savannah here. If you enjoyed today's event and you don't see your company on this board back here, I highly encourage you to talk to your folks about potentially sponsoring Georgia Brownfield Association this year. There's a lot of great benefits that come along with that, such as reduced, you get free membership to certain and entrance to certain events. You get to participate in certain things. So definitely encourage you to become a member of GBA if you are not already. And I want to thank also Service Brewing for hosting us today, and the Coastal Committee. And of course, our event sponsor, Green Rock, for sponsoring us. So.